In the song that we sang, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer, at the end of verse 1, it says, your truth is a fount of perfect wisdom. There is truth in the Word of God, and it is a fountain of perfect wisdom. You know, all through the Scriptures, we find truth. We find wisdom. And it's in all sorts of different genres. We see it in the New Testament letters. We see it in the Gospels that the disciples wrote, the apostles wrote. We see it in poetry that David writes. Some of the hymn writers in Israel wrote those. But we also see it in narrative texts. Texts in the Old Testament that tell a story. And in a narrative text, you have to get an understanding of kind of the whole story so that you can draw meaning out from one specific highlight reel that you see, like a text like 2 Samuel chapter 1. So we're going to get to that in just a moment. But I want to paint the picture for you before we get to the broader text and context, okay? Character in general is developed in the mundane, the day-to-day activities of your life. Character is seen and it's tested in defining moments in your life. So character is developed in the mundane, day-to-day, maybe the faithful routine of your life, but it's tested. It's seen most clearly in defining moments of your life. Those could be either good moments or bad moments. Moments when you receive bad news. The doctor comes out, tells you news you were not looking forward to. You were hoping would never come. That moment when he shares that news with you, that is a defining moment in your life. There can also be things that good things that happen to you, and how you respond defines or shows your character, right? And think about something like this. You're in a meeting at work and you warn everybody in the meeting, including your boss, that if you walk down this path, I think this bad situation will come. If you walk down this road and follow in this direction, I think bad's going to come. I don't think we should go down that way. I don't think we should take that road. Let's say you give that advice and then 1 month later, you give that advice, they ignore your advice. 1 month later, something bad happens. The bad thing you warned them about happened, right? You could stand over them and say, I told all of you so. I told you so, and you deserved it because you didn't listen to my voice. But character is defined in key moments, in moments where both good and bad happen. And in moments like this, when maybe you've given advice, it's not taken, and what you warned them about happened. And you can say, I told you so, or you can bite your tongue, or better yet, you can actually feel sorry for the negative outcome that happens. Character is seen in these key moments. How you respond when the coworker you have tension with succeeds. Key moments. David has a defining moment in this text. He had been waiting for the throne for years. Saul was on the throne, and yet David had been the next ordained king, anointed king. Saul was still on the throne. He was waiting for years, but not only was Saul on the throne, Saul was pursuing his life. So in this moment, in this text, 2 Samuel chapter 1, a man comes running to him, and he says, the king is dead. You'd think he would rejoice, right? You'd think he would throw a party, he'd kill the fattened calf, he'd call all people to rejoice that he's no longer on the run, and now is his time to ascend to the throne. But what do you see in the text? He's weeping. He tears his clothes. He writes a beautiful elegy that describes the best characteristics of who Saul is. This is a defining moment for David, and the question we must ask is, what was David believing about God in this moment? For him to respond with sorrow rather than rejoicing when he learned of the death of his enemy. What was David believing about God in this moment? David was trusting deeply in the sovereignty of God, which allowed him to wait for the throne. It allowed him to love his enemies, and it allowed him also to recognize and oppose injustice. And I'm going to explain that thread throughout the message. But I want to give you a little bit more context for those of you who may not be familiar with the whole entire story and the years of history that David and Saul have. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are tracing both the rise of King Saul and his fall, and the rise of King David. The prophet Samuel is the one who anointed Saul as the first king in Israel, and he anointed him, and when he anointed him as the first king, he said the continuation of his kingship was dependent upon his obedience to God. In 1 Samuel 12:14, he said, "If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, it will be well." It's a little bit of a foreshadowing because Saul did fail to obey the voice of the Lord. Most prominently, God called him to destroy this nation, the Amalekites. But he failed to destroy them completely. And Samuel comes into the camp and he says, "What are these servants doing here? Why is the king still alive?" Right? And this key moment where Saul failed to obey the voice of the Lord, Samuel told Saul that God would take away the throne from him and give it to another. Shortly after this occasion, Samuel found and anointed David, a no-name shepherd boy, as the next king in Israel. Only there was a problem. Saul was still on the throne. Okay, so David's anointed the next king, but Saul is still on the throne. Two things you have to keep in your mind. Number one, David was never told to kill Saul in order to get the throne. He was never told that. Another key piece in the story is that Saul did not know who the next anointed king was. Eventually, as David was actually serving Saul, Saul did find out that David was the next anointed king, and he tried to manipulate God's plan by putting him to death. Saul's anger towards David was motivated both by jealousy and anger. It was motivated by jealousy because David started having greater accomplishments than Saul. He started killing more and more people on the battlefield than Saul ever could dream of doing. And people, as they're parading back in victory formation, they're parading back through the streets, and people are praising David over Saul, saying Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Okay, so jealousy starts building in Saul's heart, which leads to anger. Another key piece is that he was afraid of losing the throne and it going to another, because Samuel said, "You're going to lose the throne. It's going to go to somebody else." But Saul did everything in his power to try to hold on to it, to manipulate God's plan. He dug his heels in and tried to take David's life. We'll get to a couple examples of how Saul tried to take David's life a little bit later in the message. But you need to know one other key detail. This happened over the course of about 10 years that David was on the run from Saul. Saul neglected other responsibilities that he was supposed to be doing. He neglected his work because he focused so much of his effort in trying to stop David, to kill David. And this is where we pick up in the story this morning. With an out-of-breath Amalekite, clothes torn, running to David with the news of Saul's death. And David's response was not what we would expect. And probably not what the messenger would have expected either. So we ask the question, what was David believing about God that helped him respond the way he did? Why did he weep instead of rejoice at the news of the death of his enemy? He was trusting in the sovereignty of God. And we see three things that come together in this text: that he was waiting patiently on God's timing, that he was showing love for his enemies, and that he executed justice upon someone who rose his hand against the Lord's anointed. Okay, so David is showing that he's at peace with God's sovereign plan. You know, we live in a world that's full of vulnerability and limited control. It's full of injustice. And there's so many things that are out of our control, right? As much as we want to control our lives, the reality is that we can't. You know, an Olympian can train their entire life for a 30-second race and then get a 102 fever the morning of the race, right? You can do everything right, you can train the way you should, but then things happen that you don't expect. A college graduate can get perfect grades and still not find a job. You can salt your driveway, but A piece of ice can still be there, slip, and you have a life-altering injury for several months or maybe your life forever. Right? We plan, we do all these things, but yet God is the one ultimately in control. And so in the uncertainty and vulnerability that we live in, we must lean into this truth about God, that he is sovereign, that he is in control. This reality, the sovereign control of God, is what allowed David to respond the way he did as he learned of the death of his enemy. So let's look at these three lessons. The first one you see in the worship guide there is that he waited on God's timing. So when you trust in the sovereignty of God, it allows you to wait on God's timing. Or if you want just something shorter to remember, just underline those last four words. Wait on God's timing. How is this seen in the story? Well, it's seen in the immediate context. We're going to look at that first, and then in the broader context of the story. In the immediate context, David's learning of Saul's death from the testimony of this Amalekite, okay? David is assuming that this man is telling the truth that he killed Saul. And if all you read in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel is 2 Samuel chapter 1, you'd probably believe this Amalekite as well. But if you turn back one page to 1 Samuel chapter 31, there's a story about how Saul died that contradicts this story. And the story about how Saul died is that he was wounded in battle, and he didn't want the Philistines to come and torment him and hurt him and maybe do all sorts of evil because he was captured by his enemy. So Saul took his own life on the battlefield. That's the story that we get in 1 Samuel 31. I believe that's the correct story of what happened. The Amalekite, he comes along, he sees a dead Saul in the battlefield, says, "Oh, I know how I can get some rewards here. I'm going to take his crown and his arm bracelet thing, and I'm going to bring it back to David, the sworn enemy of Saul," okay? And when I bring it to David and then he becomes the next king, I will be rewarded. I'll receive some reward, maybe monetarily, maybe I'll be the second in the kingdom. So he goes and he makes up this story, and he walks up to David and he said, "Actually, Saul was like mostly dead and I was there, and he asked me to finish him off." Okay, so that's the story that he's telling to David. And David, rather than giving this man some type of reward, he said to him, "How is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?" So David is telling the Amalekite that the Amalekite is standing in the place of God by taking the life of another, by taking the life of the king who was the Lord's anointed. And David is showing that he believed God's timing was best and that no one should try to manipulate that. So in this story, we see David had a sure confidence in the anointing of the Lord and his timing, but then we see the broader context of the story. When David was on the run from Saul, there were occasions when David could have lifted his hand against the Lord's anointed. But instead of doing so, he waited on God's timing. If you look back at 1 Samuel chapter 24, this is one of the key instances where David could have lifted his hand and destroyed Saul. 1 Samuel 24, 4 through 12 is where we see this. David's hiding in a cave because Saul is in pursuit of him. And all of a sudden, Saul is in the cave. And the same cave that David's hiding in. And his men say, "Hey, David, there he is. This is the day that God's given him to your hand." In 1 Samuel 24, verse 4, the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as shall seem good to you." Verse 5, David says to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." Later in this text, in verse 10, it says he's cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He didn't lift his hand, but instead he just used his knife to cut off the corner of his robe. He stands outside the cave after Saul's a long way off, and he's raising the corner of his robe up in the air. And he's yelling out to Saul, and he says in verse 10, "Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against the Lord, my Lord, the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you." You see it again in 1 Samuel 26, where David had another opportunity to kill Saul. David and Abishai are walking at night through the enemy camp, and they come across Saul. He's laying right in front of them. Maybe he's snoring. He's got his spear next to him and a water jug. And they say, "Hey, there's the spear. Let's destroy him now." That's what Abishai tells to David. But David says to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" So instead of killing him, they take his spear and they take his water jug. Don't worry, it's not thievery or anything, I don't think. But they took it, they borrowed it, and as they're a far way off, they lift them up again and say, "We could have killed you, but we chose to spare your life." It was clear that David waited upon the Lord to do what he promised he would do. He waited upon God. If you would turn over to Psalm 130, I want to just highlight this as a key point in this. This was David's heart. This is what he's believing in, even in these moments. Some think that this psalm, Psalm 130, was written by David as he was being pursued by Saul. He begins Psalm 130 by saying, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." Surely these would have been the depths of despair where he has his enemy pursuing him. He doesn't know how many more days he has if his enemy is going to take him, right? All these things, like there's so many uncertainties. He says, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there's forgiveness that you may be feared." So what is he doing here? He's rehearsing true things about God, that there is mercy available in him, that he forgives when we cry out to him. He continues in verse 6, "My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. More than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption. And he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities." So what is he doing here? He's waiting on the Lord. He's telling his soul to wait on God and wait on God's timing. So David was confident in the timing of the Lord. He trusted in God's sovereignty enough to say, in his timing, he'll let me have the throne. But what does this phrase, "wait on the Lord," typically mean in the Bible? Often when the Bible refers to waiting on the Lord, it explains it in an active sense. Not in the sense of you waiting at a train station for a train to arrive, but you actively working in the meantime, actively pursuing God in the middle of waiting. We can actively wait by digging into the Word of God, by getting to know who he is, his character, seeing his glory throughout all of creation and through the whole narrative arc of Scripture. We see person after person who had to wait upon the Lord to receive what they wanted or even what they were promised, right? So we can actively wait by pursuing God in the waiting, but we can actively wait by resolving in our hearts to trust God in the waiting. This is a trust that believes that he will do what he's promised to do, and it's a trust that he will be working for his glory and your good when the answer to your prayer is wait. And in this active waiting, it means that you are building your trust that he will provide you with the grace you need when his answer is no. This response requires an active waiting upon the Lord. So how can we wait upon the Lord, maybe even in our everyday life? First of all, believe that God is working for good. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love the Lord, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. You know, we often have a different definition of what we think will be good in comparison to what is ultimately good. The reason being that we are nearsighted while God can see all. We have the value system of comfort and joy while God has the value system of godliness. The greatest thing we want to pursue in life is smooth sailing, right? But God's greatest desire is for our holiness, for us to look more like him. And we have an idea of what we think will be good in this life. You know, if I get this promotion, if I get this house, or if I can retire soon, whatever it might be, these are things that we might consider ultimate good, but God may have something else in mind of what is ultimately good. David, in Psalm 27, another key text, this could have been written when he was being pursued by Saul or another troubling time in his life. He says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. What is he doing? He's showing a confident trust in God that is waiting and trusting in him even in the uncertainty of life. Our heart can take courage in the Lord when we realize that he's working in the seasons of waiting for his glory and our ultimate good. So in moments of uncertainty, when you ask, what am I supposed to do next? Take courage in the Lord who's working. In times of suffering, when you want it to end and you want God to act in a way for it to end, trust that his hands are still on the reins. When you're waiting for God to change someone's heart, or you're waiting on God for a child, or whatever else it might be, know that he sees and doesn't allow purposeless seasons of waiting. This is how the sovereignty of God hits the pavement of our lives. We recognize that he is in control and that he's working according to our good and his glory in the waiting. In this split-second reaction of David, when he hears the news of his enemy's death, we see that he's waiting on God, but we see something else that's really key. It's a key part of his character. He loved his enemies. He loved his enemies, okay? So second part of this, when you trust in the sovereignty of God, it allows you to love your enemies. Or if you want to just highlight those last three words, those are the key things to remember. So how is this seen in the story? David was a faithful servant of Saul. He played his harp for Saul when there was an evil spirit that was tormenting him. He grew close to Saul and was trusted by him. And then when jealousy and fear started rising in Saul, Saul turned on David and started seeking his life. He went from having a close companion in Saul to seeing his red face and him holding up a spear, throwing it at him, right? So there's a stark contrast here. So he goes from being friends, having trust, a mutual relationship here with Saul, to now having to duck from a spear that's being thrown at his head. We would expect, we might read this and say that David had a right to be upset with Saul. We would expect David to throw a party to celebrate when he heard the news that Saul was dead. But David responded very differently. He tore his clothes and wept. And then as you see in the second half of the chapter, part of it was read to you in verses 19 through 27. We're back in 2 Samuel chapter 1. In verses 19 through 27, David writes this lament. And it's a lament over his enemy's death. And he highlights his best characteristics. And he commanded that it should be read throughout all of Israel. So here's this man who treated him very poorly, who was seeking his life for years and years just out of jealousy and fear. And here in this situation, David writes a lament that highlights his best characteristics. Here are some things that he says about Saul: that he's beloved and lovely. He says that Saul is swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. He speaks of some of the ways that his rule even benefited the nation in verse 24. And then he honors Saul and Jonathan with the repeated phrase, how the mighty have fallen. What's David doing here? David is exemplifying great love. And he's showing what 1 Corinthians 13:7 love looks like, the love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. What is he doing? He's believing all things. He's thinking even the best of his enemy. And David is showing with his life what Jesus would later show through his life and his death. When there are guards who come to arrest Jesus in the garden, up on the Mount of Olives, the guards come to arrest Jesus, and Peter, in an overzealous attack, pulls out his sword and chops off one of the soldier's ears, right? And rather than Jesus saying, oh yeah, they deserve that because they're arresting me, no, he takes that ear and he restores it back to normal. He's showing love to his enemies. And when he's on the cross, he's calling out to those people who are crucifying him, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. This is a great love that he is showing even to his enemies. And in Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he's instructing us to love our enemies. Here's what he says. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. But this text is showing that we ought to love our enemies in the clearest sense, but it's also explaining who our enemies are. When he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, he's saying most foundationally, those who are your enemies are probably the people who are persecuting you, okay? So those who are persecuting you, you can consider your enemies. And I would guess that you've maybe not called anybody in your life your enemy. Maybe some of you have declared war on somebody that you know and they're your enemy and you call them that, but we have more people who we just struggle to get along with, or who the root of bitterness has found its way into our hearts, and we feel that towards them. We feel bitterness towards them. We have people that we're in conflict with. And in this teaching on the Mount, Jesus gets more specific than we might realize in a surface reading. In the first couple of verses, we're called to love our enemies, pray for those who persecute you, but Jesus is making an argument starting from the greatest, like probably the most obvious, and then moving its way back, even to those people that we might not usually consider our enemies. In the next verse of Matthew chapter 5, when he's giving this command, he says, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends the rain on the just and the unjust. So here in the context of love your enemies, God's saying, you know what? That's what we do. That's what God does. He loves people who are his enemies. He loves all sorts of people by making the sun rise every day, by sending rain on people who are just and unjust. This morning, all over the world, from New Hampshire down to Florida, down to South America and the tip of Argentina, the sun rose. You might not have felt it because it was about 5 degrees, but the sun rose. And the sun rose on all different types of people who oppose God. The sun rose, even on people who blaspheme God. People who want nothing to do with God. People who don't believe God exists. The sun rose on all different types of people. And he showed love to sinners. You know what? No one deserves this, but God showed it anyway. No one deserves the sun to rise every single day. That's not what we deserve, but yet God still in his grace makes the sun rise every single day. And so in the context of loving our enemies, we're being told that enemies includes those who hate you, those who you have conflict with, those who reject or ignore you. Why? Because the sun is also rising on those who reject God, who hate God, who oppose God, right? So it's kind of arguing from the less to the greater here, or the greater to the even a lesser sense here. And the call to love your enemies extends to people we might not expect on the surface. It extends to the ill-tempered family member that you have. It extends to the neighbor who thinks you snowblow too much of your driveway onto their lawn, right? It extends to your coworker that you can't get along with. All of these things, the love your enemies command extends to all of these types of people. And although you might not call them your enemy, this is the conclusion we can draw from the text as God is allowing the sun to rise on the same types of people. So, who are your enemies? Your enemies are anyone that's you're in opposition with, you have conflict with, those that you struggle to get along with. How can you love them? That is the question we must answer. You can love your enemies, first of all, by looking to Jesus. You know, we did not deserve the mercy that he gave us. We were the unrighteous that he gave himself for. And when you recognize that you, an undeserving sinner, have received boundless favor, you can also show this favor to people who you might not think deserve it. We can also love our enemies by knowing that ultimate justice is coming. You know, there have been wrongs done and our justice system falls short of making all these wrongs right. But ultimate accountability for these actions or wrong actions comes through the judgment of God. On the last day, he will judge the living and the dead. And as sinners who deserve the judgment from God, either you will, one, claim the blood of Christ as having covered your sins and paid for them in full, or you will face the full wrath of God upon yourself. But for those of us who have been mistreated, know that ultimate justice is coming for the things that nobody else has seen and for the things that nobody else can do anything about. You can love your enemies when you rest in the sovereign hand of God and recognize that ultimate justice doesn't depend upon you. It doesn't depend on you seeking revenge or trying to get back at somebody. Ultimate justice comes from God. So David's reaction to love his enemies speaks to his steadfast understanding that God was in control. His conflict with Saul was informed by his knowledge of mercy that he had been shown and his understanding that ultimate justice was coming. Okay, so that's what we see in that second part, second understanding that we can get from this text, from this key moment in David's life, that he loved his enemies. But the third aspect here is that when you trust in the sovereignty of God, it allows you to recognize and oppose injustice. How is this seen in the story? Okay, verses 14 to 16, we'll be looking at those verses in particular. David said to him, this is to the Amalekite who is claiming to have killed Saul, "How is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called to one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, 'I have killed the Lord's anointed.'" You know, this point raises a little bit of a tension in this story. On the one hand, we're called to rest in the sovereignty of God, which allows us to love our enemies, like we just talked about. And here David recognizes and enacts justice upon wrongdoing. So how can you rest in God's justice and then enact justice at the same time? How can you rest on God's justice to love your enemies the way David did to Saul, and yet see somebody who's claiming to have killed him and then execute justice at the same time? There's a bit of a tension here, but let me get into this. Part of what it means to be just or to do the just thing is to do the right thing. David here, as a leader in Israel and the next king, was to recognize and oppose injustice, especially when it came to somebody who was claiming to have killed Saul, the previous king, right? These actions of lifting a hand against the king would have been considered the highest form of treason in the ancient world. So for David to have done nothing, for him to ignore, or even worse, to have rejoiced when this man saying, "I've killed him," would have been the wrong thing for David to do. David recognized and opposed injustice. Additionally, the Amalekites were not a good group of people. We see at the beginning of this text in verse 1, David had returned from striking down the Amalekites. I think if this young Amalekite knew that David was resting in this city after having been striking down the Amalekites for who knows how many days, he probably would have thought twice before running to him with this news, right? If he knew David just got done killing your people, maybe he'd be a little more apprehensive, okay? I don't know, but I'm just guessing. We look back in the history between Israel and the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the terrorists of their day. They went into different towns and they pillaged them. They took things that didn't belong to them. They were trying to take advantage of people who are weak. And they first come onto the scene when the nation of Israel is walking through the wilderness. And the Amalekites were the ones who attacked the rear group in the big party of Israel that's walking through the wilderness. Why'd they attack the rear of the group? Because they would have been the weakest ones. They would have been the oldest ones who couldn't run away. They couldn't defend themselves. So the Amalekites come. They attack the back front of the nation of Israel as they're walking through the wilderness. And they took advantage of them. And then God said that one day we will have revenge upon them and you will execute justice on my behalf. And that was when Saul was called to take them out. And yet Saul failed to do so. And they're still roaming the earth, terrorizing people all throughout the region. And so David just finished killing the Amalekites. And here a young Amalekite comes, claiming to have killed the king of Israel. For David just to have stood back and done nothing would have been unjust. For him to say, good job, now I get to be king, would have been the wrong thing to do. He recognized and opposed injustice. But this looks a little bit more, it gets a little bit more tricky when we think of application in this. What does it look like for us to recognize and then oppose injustice in our lives? Well, we'll look at this personally and then broader on behalf of others. Personally, why is it hard? Why is it hard to recognize and oppose injustice? It can be hard to do this because it can be hard to distinguish and oppose injustice when that wrong has been done against you. Because we're often trying to make them pay and we're trying to seek revenge instead of seeking what is right over what is wrong. Trust in God's justice and sovereign control in your life. A deep trust in God's justice and sovereign control in your life can free you to look at injustice that's been done against you as objectively wrong. How? How can it do this? Because all sin is not only against you, but against a holy God who judges justly. So we can, in this, name the wrong that's been done to us. For you to name an injustice is actually a good thing to do. One example is part of this story, and David, and he's in the cave, he yells out to Saul with the corner of his robe in his hand, and he says, as the proverb of the ancients says, okay, maybe not the first thing that would come to our minds when we're waving the corner of our robe and had one of the most intense moments of our lives, but David's reflecting on Proverbs, all of these things. He comes out waving the corner of Saul's robe, and he says, as the Proverbs of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. What's he doing? He's naming that wrong has been done. He's saying, you are acting wickedly by pursuing my life, but that's not going to cause me to respond wickedly. In a few verses later in that same text, David says, may the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. So what is he also saying? He's calling evil, evil, and at the same time, he's relying upon the justice of God. When wrong has been done to us personally, what can we do? We can name it. We can say that it is wrong. Another example is Joseph at the end of the story when his brothers are standing in front of him, trembling that they're going to be destroyed for their actions against him. What does David say to them? He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He's able to recognize the evil and yet respond in an upright way. You know, the failure of the justice on this earth causes us to long for more. When someone is put behind bars for a few years for something that's altered your entire life, it doesn't seem like ultimate justice. When one person is tried and sentenced to life in prison for the death of multiple people, it still isn't what we would call fair. So to say that there has to be more is to join in the groaning of creation that's longing for the return of Christ and for him to execute ultimate justice. And we ask, how long will the wicked get off free? Or will there seem to be no consequences for those who do wrong to me? And when we ask, how long will the wicked go off free, it's to enter into the tension expressed by Asaph, the writer of the 73rd Psalm, who he's looking at all the evil in the world and he's saying, it seems like they're prospering. It seems like they're doing really well in their evil. And I don't even know if it's worth it to continue following Jesus, to continue following God. I don't know if it's worth it to continue on the path of the righteous because all these evil people seem like they're prospering. And then halfway through the Psalm 73, his perspective changes. And what changed the psalmist's perspective? He went into the house of the Lord and he considered their end. He said, although it looks like the wicked prosper here on earth, they do not ultimately prosper. God is the judge, and he will execute ultimate justice. So personally, how can we recognize and oppose injustice in our lives? We can name it. We can take advantage of the things that God has given us in our justice system to try to keep people accountable. But what about on behalf of others? You know, there's a time for us to speak up and speak out on behalf of others and oppose wrongdoings that are all around us. This young Amalekite had done wrong, not against David, but against God. It was the just and right thing to do for David to execute justice in this situation. And there are times when it's the right thing to do to speak up, to report injustice, to care for those who are suffering and hopeless. Jesus cares for the suffering and the helpless, and as followers of Jesus, we can as well. You know, when we trust in the sovereignty of God, it allows us to wait on God. It allows us to love our enemies, and it allows us to recognize and oppose injustice. The character of David was seen in this defining moment in his life, when the throne was going to be his, when he would no longer be on the run from his enemy. Yet he showed honor towards those who deserved honor. And he was at rest in God's plan. In Psalm 62, a psalm that is now written to the melody of I will wait for you. We're about to end with that song, or my soul will wait for you. David writes these things. It says, for God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. What's David expressing here? He's expressing a confident trust in the sovereignty of God. His soul is waiting. He's delivering his soul up to the Lord. It says, I'm waiting for you in silence. He's the only one who's going to bring my salvation. He's the only one who's going to deliver me from this. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I'm not going to be shaken because I have confident trust in God. He says in verse 5 of Psalm 62, for God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. For my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. David had a deep trust in the sovereignty of God, which allowed him in this defining moment of his life, when he's being told about the death of his enemy, to respond not with joy and celebration, but with lament. And when we trust in a deep way in the sovereignty of God, it allows us to wait on him, it allows us to love our enemies, and allows us to recognize and oppose injustices that are around us.